to episode 4 of Consensus Unreality. We are here today talking with Elizabeth Scott, a poet, a practitioner of ceremonial magic, and a worker of the tarot, among other things. Also responsible for transmitting the work of other great designers, artists, and writers through her collaborative platform, Sishu72. What's up, Elizabeth?
Hey, thank you guys for having me.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah.
We're super excited. This is our first interview, and we hope to do many more. So I think we can jump in with this first interrogation here. When you were younger, can you remember like some inklings that sort of began the spark of your interest in the occult, or like esoteric literature, or maybe just like general strangeness?
Yeah. I mean, definitely when I was young, I had a lot of weird experiences, like I would say with maybe spirits or ghosts, which I actually don't. The last true like ghost experience I had was maybe when I was, I think it was almost a decade ago now. But when I was younger, I was like wide open. And I think it's because it was before I, was doing any kind of protective work or banishing work or kind of closing the door to that, so to speak. Like, I think the fissure through which things can enter is a little bit more contained now. But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because just as a poet and as an esotericist, kind of like the place where I began to feel interested in poetry, and the place where I think I began to feel the significance of, the hidden world, kind of began with the same thing, which is just that, I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, and at that time, my parents were still together, and my dad is basically, he's devoted his life to studying ancient Egyptian art and art history. So when I grew up there, we spent a lot of time at this museum where he was a curator at that time. And, I think all language is sort of alien, but specifically pictorial languages and languages that we don't understand, or that we aren't able yet to comprehend, contain this sort of mystery and power. And so I just remember being a kid and spending time at this museum with my dad, and kind of him going through, reading these hieroglyphs to me, and, the language itself, as he translated it, it had a poetic voice. And it was also foreign, of course, because it was coming from another culture, with its own worldview. But, the combination of just these strange images and, strange to me images, I should say, and this text, which concerned, life, death, and mysteries, and was written in a non-everyday kind of style, both like piqued my interest in that. And then I guess kind of as I got older, I just continuously had these experiences with ghosts, or what I believe were ghosts. And I think that kind of was like the opening of the world, where things held a potential to kind of be different than what other people perceived or what other people expected. Because I would talk about these experiences to family members or friends, and they would be like, oh, like I was like the one that the one that talks about ghosts or whatever in my family. So they were just like, oh, it's Elizabeth. She saw a ghost. And that was just kind of how it was.
Yeah, I love that answer, especially like conjuring the visions of being in that museum and sort of that relationship with things that are so profanely sacred, like the hieroglyphs and stuff, like language that was only constructed by sort of like these initiates, you know, very exclusive.
Yeah. And I mean, definitely also, I think as I've gotten older, my relationship to that has become a lot more complicated. The way I view that, you know, the history of stolen artifacts, which were never meant to be moved. It's
right.
very colonial. But it is also, I think, I don't know. I think with any pictorial language or any hieroglyphic writing, there's always that kind of window into sort of what letters can be when they contain more than just the representation of a sound.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think your that sort of foundational interest in hieroglyphics had something to do with your later interest in tarot? And I mean, I guess poetry, of course, but do you think there's a link between tarot and that sort of pictographic language?
I mean, for me, and it's funny because my dad and I are far from close, but he was really like the kind of person who sparked my interest in just various forms of esotericism. So when I was a teenager, he gave me his old deck of tarot cards, along with a couple books written by Arthur E. Waite and, you know, the classic Pictorial Guide to the Tarot. And yeah, I mean, they were a deck of Rider-Waite cards, and I just became really obsessed with them, because I don't know. I think it's also funny because I always kind of approached it from this sort of intuitive angle. Like, I think it wasn't until, you know, maybe a year or two later that I really started to dive into the symbols of the tarot and what they meant and what they stood in relation to. And I really, I honestly personally think I benefited from this like hillbilly style of just diving into it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, he definitely was the sort of originator for that in my life.
Cool. Yeah.
And so I think we're going to be super excited to talk about the Goetia and grimoire ceremonial magic, as you are a practitioner of both. And maybe we could talk a little bit about, sort of before we go hard into the Goetia stuff, maybe how there's like a feedback between your artistic practices and these magical languages.
Totally. Yeah. I would say in terms of, I mean, I think poetry is a medium that is, I don't know, it's something that I think is a little bit harder for people to get into or to see immediate connections. But to me, you know, when you think about the history of writing, even when you think about the history of in the grimoire tradition, a lot of the spirits that are gods of magic, Hermes is a very classic example, but there are many more, are also gods of writing. So there's just always been this sort of immediate connection, just even in terms of the word grimoire. It relates to the French grammaire, which was in relation to books that are written in Latin. So to me, you know, I'm primarily a poet, and I work in other mediums, mostly, you know, kind of like presenting and supporting other artists and their work. But in terms of my creative practice, thinking about poetry, thinking about rhythm, repetition, it brings to mind incantation. And I sort of wonder if poetry began with incantation potentially.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, we think of early epics like Gilgamesh or Beowulf, and it's really clear, especially with, you know, like Anglo-Saxon kenning. It's like there's this sort of sense of language and its mystique kind of being contained in the sounds, having this rhythm, and also kind of containing these riddles, and warranting a rereading and a rereading. And this sort of sense of repetition can place you into almost a trance state.
Right. Yeah, that's totally.
You know, and then there are figures like Sappho, who is arguably the mother of, you know, what poetry ultimately became. And she is a really good example of a poet who combined this kind of like recognition of the divine, largely through gods and spirits, and then this sort of subjectivity and interiority of her experience, both with that and just with sort of this like sensuous world.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's a long tradition of overlap between occultism and poetry. You know, we could talk about like Yeats, or just like the connections between surrealism and occult doctrines, or just the history of poetry's relationship to prayer, invocation, connection with like the Godhead or with gods.
Totally. You kind of just tore through a bunch of the stuff I wanted to ask about. That's awesome. Yeah.
Guess we could wrap up then.
I guess.
Just kidding.
In your like email earlier, I guess you mentioned Stephen Jonas and Peter Redgrove as two poets that you've been reading lately. How do you see that sort of stuff play out in their work?
Yeah. So Stephen Jonas, I became very obsessed with after City Lights printed the posthumous release of a collection of his work called Arcana. And he, for anyone that isn't familiar with him, he's a Black American poet. He's gay, and he wrote in the 50s and 60s as part of Boston's what is called the Occult School of Poetry. He was like a contemporary of Jack Spicer and John Wieners, but he is like a very fascinating poet, both because he kind of represents this, he's like a real fountain of knowledge on, you know, myth, a variety of poetry from ancient times to the present, just history in general. And then this sort of relationship that he had to jazz music and his love of jazz. He often recited his poems to jazz. And I think he wrote a lot of his poems with keeping in mind that they should be recited, that they should be read and experienced out loud. And he just has this sort of sense of musicality that is like very playful, but also kind of, you know, the way that he uses these sort of slant rhymes and the way that he is like matching ideas and sounds is really interesting.
Yeah.
And I know there's this quote from him that I love because he's also a very mysterious guy. Like he kind of like the artist Jack Smith, he kind of wove this tapestry of tall tales sort of surrounding his birth. No one really knows where he was born or to whom. And he, you know, being an esotericist, said it's easier to explain where to and fours of alchemy than to tackle the Jonas mystery. He's just like a very mysterious figure. So I highly recommend giving his work a read.
Yeah, he's a great hoaxer kind of too, right?
Yeah.
What's that?
We can definitely, we can jump into hoaxing because we've been talking a lot about that in the past couple weeks. But I think maybe we should talk a little bit about the Goetia and the Lesser Key of Solomon. And here's the unanswerable question, but for our listeners who don't know what the hell we're talking about, what is the Goetia? Yeah,
so I think it's interesting, you know, you mentioned the Lesser Key, and I think that's a lot of people's introduction to it. You know, through Mathers and Crowley and their writing on it and sort of their interest in that text. And that was certainly my introduction to it. Through this, you know, Solomonic magic technique of getting into that ritual space. To me, though, it's interesting because I think my understanding of what Goetic magic is has really evolved with the work of Jake Stratton Kent, who is, in my opinion, like one of just the most formative kind of minds who's been really trying to return Goetic magic to its proper place as a legitimate tradition, which is has a sort of significance that is much deeper than it's understood. So I think, to me, Goetic magic is this sort of connection with our archaic past and sort of the thread, or the, as Terence McKenna would say, like the shamanic thread that moves through history from ancient times to the present, and which is connected with necromancy and low magic.
Right.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. And so for our listeners who still are grasping at open water here, the Goetia, at its lowest understanding, is the conjuration of these sort of biblical demons, whether you understand it to be contacting entities, spirits, or if it's sort of like the more Jungian, totemic aspects of our own psyche. It is the actual manifestation of these visual entities through magical languages. Yeah, and I guess I'm interested in sort of like the intersection of the physical ramifications of this stuff, and the ethereal, and maybe sort of like the alchemical processes involved, and maybe if you, I know it's kind of personal, but if you do want to talk a little bit about what sort of these conjurations entail, and what the process is sort of like.
Sure. Yeah. So kind of as far as I have come to believe, what we call theurgy and what we would call ceremonial magic, which I also don't specifically identify as like a ceremonial magician anymore. But all of this developed basically directly out of the elements of the Goetia. And so it's really interesting because when I first became interested in, specifically, like many others, like became interested in the spirits that are cataloged in the Lesser Keys. So I remember talking to people who were maybe more specifically used to working with angels, and with, I guess, intelligences that are less earthbound, and having these conversations with people who would say, oh, I don't work with chthonic spirits. And to me, it's interesting because there is this weird taboo against it. And I think it has been really maligned and kind of misunderstood by a lot of occultists. But if we actually think of the chthonic realm as the substratum, we can see that it's the foundation, kind of like, you might say mycelium, or like these mycological networks that connect below the surface of the earth. But yeah, I think that there is this tradition in within the grimoire tradition, or there is this sort of like history of this great depth and significance, which deals with the primal realities, all of the difficult experiences that those we were descended from went through, this need for food or shelter, like that is spoken to in depth in, a lot of the medieval grimoires. That's kind of like, it's covered, but there are other things that are covered too, which is kind of what makes it so interesting. Something that I love that Jake Stratton Kent wrote about in his book of the True Grimoire, which is basically his reconstruction of that grimoire from kind of like a comparative literature standpoint of, looking at different translations of the text, the French and Italian. He kind of speaks about necromancy as a rejected knowledge. And, his belief or his theory that he kind of bases this book on, which is meant to trace partially the origins of the spirits, but also more so, I think, the origins of the actual system of working itself, is that basically the human capacity for symbolic thought would have been activated for the first time through ritual before it was deployed to like scientific cultural advances. So kind of like the notion that what we've gained as a society, we've gained through our kind of like necromantic urge. And when I say necromancy, I kind of mean working with chthonic spirits or working with the spirits of the dead. And usually kind of in that more Saturnian and immediate way where there's a need, and you apply to these spirits with whom you potentially have a relationship to address that. But yeah, I mean, I think to me, what really blew me away and kind of got me into seeing it from a different angle, or allowed me to sort of, within my own mind, make this connection, that Goetic magic is more than what is said about it or what has been said or accepted about it, was just kind of coming into an understanding of this sort of intermediary spirit figure. And you see that later with John Dee, right. There's this, he is using, and I'm not versed in Enochian magic, but I know that he used Kelly as his seer in the Mendel system. And right. In basically like the system that moves through time, like from ancient time to the present, through to like Trithemius, art of drawing spirits into crystals, through to John Dee, through to the Abremelin system, involves this kind of like intermediary spirit, similar to the holy guardian angel in Abremelin, which gives access and conversation with the other spirits. And this system that is present specifically in the True Grimoire, the Grimorium Verum, which is a grimoire from the 1800s or the 18th century. It originates essentially, or it's seen first within the Greek magical papyri, which is a very fascinating early grimoire that is syncretic in terms of kind of involving spirits from really like a cavalcade of different cultures, the Greeks, the Egyptians. There are these sort of syncretized gods, but it is essentially the maybe not the beginning of the grimoire system, but the beginning of this method wherein there's an intermediary spirit whose presence is invoked. The spirit gives access to the others. And, from there you can either ask these other spirits questions, or ask for something in specific. One will volunteer. The original spirit can clear the others away, and then the selected god can kind of commune with the magician. So that is kind of, to me, it's like a lot of times in my own work, I use Johannes Trithemius kind of method of crystallomancy, just scrying into and drawing spirits into crystal. And I don't know, it's sort of is Goetic magic provides the thread which is present in all of those practices, but really kind of hasn't been recognized as such. You know, it hasn't been recognized as the sort of, what would you say, like the resin in which this tradition has been preserved and moved through time. So it has this significance that's really deep.
Yeah, I love when there's sort of that collision of mysticisms from different religions. That's sort of where we get Gnosticism occurring and all sort of the mystery wrapped up with like the Templars from when they went to the Crusades and sort of picked up Sufism. When there's sort of that like dialogue between very old languages of mysticism, you kind of get like these amazing results.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that really got me obsessed with, beyond everything else, just the history of the grimoire tradition, which is very rich. The historian Owen Davies writes a lot about this sense of how understanding the history of the grimoire tradition aids you in understanding how Christianity spread, how Islam spread, how early science developed, what influence print had, which is something I'm super obsessed with.
Yeah.
Just like how literacy has grown, and also just how colonialism has impacted everything, how slavery has it's very much a part of this history. These texts move from Europe, they move to South America, they move to America, and they do different things where they move. Parts of them are adopted and syncretized with other religions, but it's you can really kind of see this impact of colonialism moving in real time, and just as Western culture expands across the ocean, essentially.
Yeah.
And sort of like, I guess talking about manifestation through language, I mean, that's, the word of God, quote unquote. I guess maybe this question is pointless, but does your sort of work, being a practitioner of magic, does it lead you to sort of theorize on like the nature of these things in terms of, I don't know, maybe sort of panpsychism or something, or do you think it's something more totemic, sort of in a Jungian sense?
Sorry, will you rephrase the question? I'm not totally understanding.
Yeah, in terms of like contacting spirits and stuff, do you sort of begin to like theorize if it's something more like totemic aspects?
Oh, do I think that there are spirits that you are literally conjuring, or do I think it is more like a psychological urge or part of the mind?
Yeah, or if there's even like a point of making the distinction.
I have a very both and approach to life and magic. I feel like one of the things that attracts me to the esoteric tradition is kind of the fact that in order to partake of it, in order to work with it, you have to be able to hold almost any belief for the amount of time that you're carrying out a ritual. So I don't know, I think it's very much my nature to sort of move back and forth in understanding. But as far as my relationships with the spirits that I work with go, I would say my understanding is that they're real, but then there's a wider picture that's sort of more of the, oneness
right.
sort of situation of, the way you talk to a character in a dream, and in the dream they're separate, but they're also part of your psyche. Like, there are like things I can theorize on a larger level, but to me here now, I would say my belief is that they're real. But, I think it's interesting because I'm also somebody who is by nature skeptical, and I think it's very important to be able to at least temporarily move back and forth in between worldviews for like any period of time.
Yeah, exposing yourself to a different reality tunnel.
I feel like chaos magic is a very good teacher of that.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess today, do you see any? I mean, we're going through all these changes, right? All this terrible stuff happening to the world. Do you see
You
any?
can say that again.
Do you see any kind of like change in the world of the spirits? Is there any sort of like mirroring happening there? How do you see this
I love
whole
that question. Yeah,
this
great.
crisis? How do you see the crisis unfolding in that other world, or that aspect?
Yeah, I would say I see that the most with my my ancestors that I work with. Because I specifically charge them with work that maybe could be called more political. Like I specifically charge them to, or ask them to do work here in this realm that is, immediately helpful to not only myself, my friends, my family, but like the community that I'm a part of. And I feel like since things in my life got crazier, which, they've been crazy, but in March, I think when COVID hit in New York, there was nothing really like it. Like it was just very intense here. They really ramped up. They just went full speed ahead. And I actually, on the eve of the new year, I always ask for a divinatory dream from them about what the year is going to sort of show us. And the dream that I had was very crazy. And it was actually very funny because I didn't totally understand the dream until I watched. And it's funny that I was very late watching The Seventh Seal, Ingmar Bergman, and I watched that this year. And the ending of The Seventh Seal was very much the dream that I had, or related to the dream that I had. It used the same language, and I was like, plague movie. So.
Right.
Yeah. I think in that realm, and also I would say my dreams are my internal world and the dreams that I have are more vivid than I've ever had before. So
yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, and I mean, for the purpose of this show, obviously we have to ask what your thoughts are on UFOs.
On UFOs.
But just because like the past 2 weeks, we've basically done shows about abductees, contactees, and sort of, we've been talking a lot about this idea of how the hoax sort of morphs into a sort of golem or like a hyper sigil itself and masks itself as reality and then becomes reality in a sense.
Yeah, so, like I said, I don't know a lot about it. I feel strangely sensitive to it. Like it overwhelms me to even dive too deep into it. I'll get over it at some point. But yeah, I honestly I feel like when I watched Hypernormalization for the first time by Adam Curtis, there's kind of like that segment on UFOs that I thought was really interesting. And it's really funny for someone like me who just told you that, yes, I believe that all of, the demons that are named and referenced in these various spirit catalogs are completely real. Like, I think it's funny for me to turn around and say I have kind of like not a skeptical view of UFOs. I feel like a lot of my friends who I respect quite a bit are like deeply interested in it. But I also see the capacity to kind of project, I think our desires that there's someone out there to kind of save us from impending crisis, which is impending. That there is something out there that has access to this technology that's beyond our view. But I'm not altogether close to it. When I was young, a good friend of mine that I went to high school with, and a couple other friends were all in a car together, and they all swear that they saw a UFO. And I trust them, it's just weird. It's like, I don't really know. I don't have a fully formed opinion on it.
Right. I think the UFO thing is not entirely distinct from the magic thing. I think they're very much...
Yeah, I had
spectrum.
an ex who was obsessed with talking about how angels and aliens are the same.
Oh, that's the sort of the archon. The archon theory is like very popular. The old Gnostic adage of sort of these malevolent rulers derived from the 7 planets. That we could save that for 10 episodes from now, but
yeah. I mean, I wouldn't go as far as saying, like angels are aliens or aliens are angels, but that there's a sort of a line that moves from, invocation and magical practices all the way through, like, contactees in the 50s and 60s, that sort of thing. I think that there's a through line,
At some point I'll get over my fear and read more about it.
Yeah, well, there's tons of books on it.
Yeah,
it's funny because it is the one thing that I actually feel afraid of. Like, it is not, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of funny. I just feel like whenever I got into Goetic magic, maybe my lens was more Judeo-Christian than it is now. And so the thought of, communing with a demon, it's heavy. So I wasn't scared to do that. And I will say that in terms of just having an experience of manifestation, like where the spirit was there as if in the flesh, and where things happened in my house that would have been scary in another context. Like, that didn't scare me either, although it does jolt the respect into you. But yeah, I don't know. For some reason, aliens are like the thing I'm not ready to touch.
Oh, it should definitely scare the hell out of you, because it'll just drive you insane, like the cloudiness of it all, especially like we discussed last week, sort of the whole element of, or the cloud of unknowing of government secrecy involved, and sort of all the operatives and stuff. It just makes it even more frustrating.
I mean, I've been thinking about that a lot in terms of even just COVID conspiracies. Like, I feel like the thing that I've been thinking about consistently about conspiracies and conspiracy theories is how much they develop in a space where there's either like a vacuum of information, or information is being deliberately obscured, or there's like competing information. And I feel like it's like, I don't know, I've just been considering how that kind of like lack of clear leadership, lack of clear kind of guidance in terms of how to even move forward just creates this space where like we don't have the answers, so we create them. And And it's interesting too, because I think the other thing with extraterrestrials is kind of, I don't know, it's almost like, and again, yeah, maybe a bit of a hypocritical stance to take, and not totally committed to this thought. It's just something I've considered. You know, sometimes I feel like it is easier to almost like to consider that there is something that is massively behind the scenes, that is orchestrated, that is being hidden from you. And that there is a conspiracy. It's like, it's a little bit, yeah, I mean, even beyond that, it's a little bit more comforting to consider that, I think, on some level than like, this is a train and it's spinning out of control. I mean, I don't know where I fall on that spectrum. I'm a Libra, so I think I'm just constantly oscillating between kind of different viewpoints, not committed, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's definitely the rational take on conspiracy theories.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I believe that. I feel mad that I said it already.
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of it really does feel like it was cooked up in like a focus group or something sometimes, like for the perfect virality or something.
Right.
Like, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I really think, I mean, MK Ultra is something that I'm more like versed in and down to talk about in terms of things the government has hidden from us. And that, I mean, the things that they've released about that.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about like MK Ultra in some crazy ass, like the music industry is Illuminati, like highbrow or like lowbrow way, just like more this essence of, you know, they like the CIA released these documents that did happen.
They say that they actually did.
Yeah, what they're willing to own up to is so disturbing. I mean, you know, and I think, you know, again, tying into COVID and tying into these sort of elements of conspiracy. I am forgetting the name of that study that was done on Black Americans, wherein they were given syphilis.
The Tuskegee experiment.
Yeah, and like that is again like fully admissible. So it's not beyond, like it isn't beyond my comprehension that there could be, you know, UFOs, extraterrestrials, that this information is being hidden by the government. Conspiracies do exist. There are tons of conspiracies. I just wonder, you know, to what level are these conspiracies successful, you know?
So I guess that's where you land on lizard people.
I remember reading David Icke. I mean, I should probably just tell you guys that when I was in middle school, I was down to go really hard on conspiracy theories. So
I think like it's really like we were so excited to talk to you about the Goetia and you know, these magical languages and practices because I think sort of the frustration of researching the history of ufology and sort of these charlatan characters, and then you have operatives, and there's just like so much dodginess to it. Where sort of the element of control that you can implement, where you're sort of saying that you're actually like taking control of your relationship with sort of the spirit realm, quote unquote. I think it's just really interesting to hear that in contrast sort of to the UFO stuff.
Which, taking control, how do you mean?
Just sort of like through these processes, say something like the Goetia, where it's sort of this like very heavy discipline where if you're not like finishing the process, you know, and you have to implement like this regimented control, as I would assume, right?
I mean, that's the interesting thing. I think that, you know, like I said, it's like getting into it through a Solomonic lens. I actually found that there were a lot of elements of that style of working that you can just, you know, first it was like approaching it by rote, doing everything. And then you find, there are some things that are included in this text that were specifically included to alienate the poor, you know, to alienate people who didn't have access to money. This isn't necessary. And then experimenting and finding what can be included, what cannot be included. And I guess gradually, it's not to say that I never do Solomonic magic. It's just with these spirits, I get very disillusioned with the process, because I think, I don't know, there is a certain formality, I would say, that needs to be observed when you make contact with any new spirit. But as you develop a working relationship with a spirit, that formality no longer becomes necessary. I remember, I think it was Jason Miller, maybe, I was listening to an interview with, where he spoke about, I believe he did this invocation of Astaroth as like a teenager. And he said, well, she showed me that the magical circle was basically just a farce. And I think in Solomonic magic, a lot of the things that are there either to protect the magician, like, I guess it's also just like, if you are looking at Goetia as though it were, as though these demons were a part of your mind, as some people do.
Right.
Do you want to, curse and bind these spirits, these beings into submission in this, very Judeo-Christian, very patriarchal way? Or are there other ways that you can work with them? And I feel like to follow I feel like the practice of following the system laid out in the Grimorium Verum taught me so much about what what lies beyond, sort of when you sort of, still occupying the space of being the magus, still occupying the space of your will, but sort of it presents an alternative way of working with those spirits and connecting with them, and kind of entering into affinity or kinship with them, than is offered in Solomonic magic. And I would also say, tracing the history of what a lot of these demons really are, is very fascinating.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of different potentialities, there are a lot of possibilities.
Right.
And we who are raised with a Judeo-Christian lens can easily see the word demon and associate it with this very specific thing that you're probably imagining too,
Yeah.
But when we think about the long history of paganism, the long demonization of paganism, and all of the ways that spirits and magic have moved from their beginnings in Persia with Zoroaster, and like all ever since, to the very present, it sort of feels a lot more open to me. And these spirits sort of begin to feel more familial to me, to the point where I don't work in that way anymore. I don't feel like, I also think control is a thing. I don't know. It sort of is the Wild West in terms of magic for me. Like, if I want to work with an environment that is very controlled, I will practice, I will work with, Renaissance and medieval astrological magic. I'll kind of do something where I know if I calculate the exact time that I am supposed to do this specific ritual, I will end up with this exact result. Right. And with Goetic magic, it's like that all goes out the door in my experience. It's really, and again, I keep mentioning Jake Stratton Kent, and I highly recommend anyone listening to just read his work, because I think it's super important. But he talks a lot about the notion of burnt fingers, like, kind of just jumping in as soon as you feel the inclination, and just kind of being ready to like char yourself a little bit. And I feel like that sort of willingness to give up control is the only thing that is sort of given me any measure of magical prowess kind of as I've gotten older, if that makes sense.
No, that was an excellent answer. Like great insights on it too. And I love that anecdote about the magical circle being a farce. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember hearing that and like laughing because I feel like that's something that you experience. I mean, I experienced for sure. Just like these spirits are in some cases very, very big and very ancient.
Right.
And I mean, it's just interesting the ways in which they will impress that upon you.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of them are like gods kind of recontextualized, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So, they're going to be, have some pride or something, right?
Yeah.
Gotta have some pride.
Yeah. So as far as your current tarot practices, I mean, I guess it's interesting that before I knew that you knew Dave, you had done a tarot reading for me.
Oh, yeah.
And I think back then you mentioned that there was a lot of stuff coming up for a lot of your... has anything been coming up a lot lately? Like, is anything in the air with the tarot right now? Card-wise?
Yeah, I've actually taken a break from doing client readings, and in my own kind of divination practice a lot of the time for myself, I will either do a divination by asking a spirit questions, I'll scry, nice. I'll listen to my dreams. I'm a little bit more abstract with it for myself at this point.
Interesting.
But I think, around the time that I gave you a reading, I felt like I was giving the same reading over and over again. Because it was the first time that I've ever really like had all my clients going through at least like one similar thing at the same time, where it's like, oh, worldwide, everything is shut down. I'm talking to my clients in Berlin. I'm talking to my clients in Vancouver. And like, I'm talking to my clients in America. And it was sort of across the board, like everyone was looking for the same answers. It was honestly a little bit overwhelming just because I felt like, well, I was specifically, a lot of people were asking questions like, when will COVID end? It's like, I would probably ask like an epidemiologist, but I don't know that I would necessarily ask the tarot personally.
Yeah, So stepping away from tarot a bit. Yeah, I can see. I think a lot of the most, but for your own personal divination, what I do is it tends to be less systems based for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I love the tarot. I think it's very much a thing that I connect to my client work at this point.
Right. That makes sense.
But it is so, I mean, it's like you develop your own, I'm just so familiar with it at this point that I can whip it out and like tell someone what's going on in 5 seconds, which is like a great tool. But I actually find it more confusing as a personal tool than,
that makes sense.
Just writing down my dreams and working with them.
Right. You have that whole system inside your mind already, kind of. Yeah. The
brain. Or it's a little bit more like, I think in tarot, I don't know. There's definitely that. The only time in which I would ever want to like read tarot for myself is if I'm having like a love conundrum or like a work situation. And
I see.
Those are situations where there's like a lot of desire. I think a lot of the reason that I'm able to do good work for other people, whether that's, spell work that I'm being hired for, or it's a tarot reading, is because I have no stake.
I see. Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're about at the 50-minute mark. I guess we could close up. I think, if the rest of our interviews are half as good as this one, we'll be on the right track.
Totally.
Incredible insights on the Goetia, especially.
Yeah.
It was just super interesting to hear all that. And I guess, would you like to close this out with something?
Me?
A reading?
Oh, like me? Yeah, actually, I would love to read a little Peter Redgrove for you.
That would be
since
awesome.
We were talking about it.
Yeah.
There is a poem that I think is more in relation to Goetia, but I actually want to read this other poem that I think is more musical and kind of captures that sense of what the poet Kaveh Akbar calls like the presence of the long, faultless tongue of God, or like the notion of like hymning directly to God. So this poem by Peter Redgrove is called Nude Descending. The saint has multiplied her limbs, every thread of drapery and nerve feeling into each corner of the room as she descends the stairs. The nude, clothed only in her vapors, her great power sleeves, even in the banal condominium, now full of grace felt out by her. With each fresh step, a new set of feelers is created, or wings for her auric fields resemble the gold grain of a moth wing. If we did not know that here is a nude descending, we would believe we were in the presence of a queen of moths and her perfumes, which were also light like clothes and provisional ears and muslin radio dishes. Since this gracious passing through epiphany was mediated by the odors, we do not now need any contrived pomps, for each breath of air, each lungful is a palace. Cool. Thank you guys for having me.
Amazing.
Awesome.
Incredible.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you
for
so
coming
much.
on.
Yeah, talk to you guys soon. Have a lovely day.
And
too.
we'll be back next week. That's it for us.
All right.
If you are still listening on SoundCloud, we ask that you please hop onto Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or YouTube. All of the archived episodes will be there, and they will not be hosted on SoundCloud.
Yep.
Cheers.